Well, there you go.
Super, I have to say.
It's a pretty. I still love it every time I see it. And it's an amazing 35 millimeter print that they have here.
Yeah.
Some of the versions of it that have come out over the years have not been as well restored. It was filmed in Eastman color, which does not hold up as well as some of the other color treatments. And the early VHS releases were pan and scan, so you lose some of the stuff going on the sidelines and so forth.
I was just wondering, can you tell us the first time you saw the Forbidden Planet? What age you were and the effect it had on you when you watched it?
Well, that's an interesting question. I've often tried to remember what was the first time I saw it. I don't know. I was born in 1948. The film was released in 56, so I would have been 8 years old. And I think I may have seen it on its first release at 8 years old at the DeWitt Theater in Bayonne, New Jersey, which was our biggest theater in town. But it's possible my memory is playing tricks on me. You know, in those days, of course, no streaming services, no internet, no Blu-rays, no DVDs, no VHS tapes. If you missed a movie when it was in theater, you had a hope that someday it would come on television, and you had to happen to catch it when it came on television, because it might not come on television again for another year.
And no way to record it.
Right. When I started going to science fiction conventions, though, in those days, again, I started going conventions in 1971. Still before VHS tapes or DVDs or any of that. Conventions in those days had film rooms in which you could see many of the classic science fiction films that you may have missed in the theaters and missed when they rarely ran on TV. So it was certainly part of some of those film rooms where they would show it, probably on a 16 millimeter version, which was the thing that you could get for small projectors back then.
Yeah, because they didn't really start showing reruns of movies, until, I think, wasn't it maybe the Universal Monster movies, they started doing reruns of them in theaters. It wasn't something, we're used to the idea of a nostalgia going back.
No, they didn't do that at all. They didn't show old movies in theaters.
Yeah, they didn't.
And I don't know how it was in Ireland, but in the United States, it depended on where you lived. Now, I was lucky to live in the New York metropolitan area, where we had not only the 3 networks and PBS, the public broadcasting, but we had 4 independent stations. So I had like 8 channels that I could watch. Most places in America were lucky if they had 3, and some of them only had 1 or 2 in smaller towns and smaller cities. And the independent channels in particular that were not affiliated with a network, they were the ones that tended to show the most old movies because they had no access to the network shows during prime time. In the New York area, there was something called the $1 Million Movie that would show an old movie like all week, so you had a chance to see it, and then next week they would show another old movie.
But there's a certain, isn't there also, I think, a certain the idea, it's almost like your event of the week, Yes. It makes you really look forward to it, and it makes you really pay attention to it as well. You know details, you think about it a lot when you can't actually rewind it except in your memory.
Right. Of course, if you were waiting for a movie and somehow you missed it, then that was horrible. God damn it, I wanted to see that movie, I missed it, and when will they ever run it again?
Yeah, and your friends have seen it.
That's right. Let me talk a little about this for those of you who may not know it. It was made in 1956. The 50s were a great era for science fiction film. Science fiction television had started in the late 40s. And of course, we'd had the atomic bomb. We were living in the space age. In America, we'd captured the German V-2 rockets, and we were testing them down in White Sands. And of course, Hiroshima and Nagasaki had gone up in atomic clouds. It was the atomic age. It was the space age. And only a year after this, the Russians would launch Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, and send all of America into a panic that we were behind the Russians in space. So in the early television eras, there was a lot of science fiction television, shows that are largely forgotten these days. There was Tom Corbett's Space Cadet, based loosely on material from Robert A. Heinlein. There was Captain Video, which was on the old Dumont network, which is largely forgotten today. It was the third network in the early days of American television. And Captain Video, a 15-minute daily show, 5 days a week, 15 minutes live, was Dumont's most successful show. Today, they did hundreds of shows, but because it was live, like 20 of them survive. And Captain Video and his sidekick, who was a kid called the Video Ranger, would have these space adventures which were all on like one set. And occasionally when they ran short, Captain Video would say, "Video Ranger, let's see what's happening in the Old West." And they would turn it on and watch an adventure of the Texas Rangers in the Old West, who were evidently the ancestors of the Video Rangers. There was Rocky Jones' Space Ranger, which is the only one that survives because they made that one on film. And you can still get Rocky Jones tapes. But these were all kiddie shows. There was the Flash Gordon show too that was made in West Germany, but syndicated in the United States. And the spaceships all looked pretty much like V-2 rockets. In fact, some of them were V-2 rockets, where they just cut in the footage of them being tested. Television was a very cheap medium then, and cheap and sleazy and all that, but the success of these shows did not go unnoticed in Hollywood. And beginning in the early 50s, we started to see some science fiction films that are still remembered today. Films like The Thing from Another World, the first version of The Thing, which has been remade several times. George Pal did War of the Worlds, actually a very nice version of War of the Worlds, starring Gene Barry, that came out. In '51, there was The Day the Earth Stood Still with Michael Rennie and Patricia Neal. Again, a classic version, remade terribly in more recent years. And there were several others. MGM at that time was the premier studio, and they watched people like 20th Century Fox and Republic Pictures and RKO making these science fiction films with varying degrees of success. And they decided to get into the game, and this was Forbidden Planet. And these other movies most of them were black and white. War of the Worlds wasn't, but Day the Earth Stood Still was, The Thing was. They decided they would make a picture, a science fiction A picture, and Forbidden Planet was the one that they came up with. The first two screenwriters who came up with the story, you saw their credits there, Adler and what was the other guy's name?
It's actually just slipped my
Yeah,
mind too,
I have
it written down.
Irving Bloch and Alan
That's
Adler.
right, yeah.
They produced a treatment for a thing called Fatal Planet, which was set on Mercury, believe it or not, in the far future year of 1976. Fortunately, then they gave it to a screenwriter named Cyril Hume, who changed the title to Forbidden Planet and wrote the screenplay that you saw. There's always a story about the guy who saw a Shakespeare play for the first time, and was asked, what did you think of it? And he said, well, it was full of cliches. And if you've ever seen Citizen Kane, which is considered one of the greatest films of all time, a lot of young people seeing Citizen Kane for the first time don't understand what all the fuss was about. It's a pretty good story. Orson Welles is great and all that, but the real shock of Citizen Kane was the cinematic techniques that were used for the first time in that film, which really revolutionized the way directors shot movies. Except it revolutionized it to such an extent that virtually every movie since then uses the same techniques.
Yeah.
So when you see it, you don't realize how revolutionary it was.
Yeah, it's like, we're standing on the shoulders of giants.
Right.
Every era has a new giant, a new And so what looks like new to us is actually a reinvention of what's gone before.
And Forbidden Planet is the same case. This was a hugely important film in the history of science fiction in television and film. It was the first film that showed human beings, Earthmen from Earth, going out to the stars. There had been a few earlier films that had going on rocket ships, as they called them, to Mars or to Venus. And of course there have been many films with aliens coming to Earth, like The Thing from Another World or War of the Worlds. But this had us going out to the stars in a starship of our own invention and colonizing the galaxy. All the movies since, in particular, there's a show some of you may remember, Star Trek. Yeah, you've heard of that show?
Yeah, and they had a hyperdrive in this.
Yes, they had a hyperdrive, and when they're getting out in the deceleration procedure, they're standing on little circular plates
I know,
that look strangely like the transporter beam. And the central triad of the Commander Adams, the executive officer, and the doctor is strangely similar to the central triad of Star Trek with the doctor and Spock and the captain. He scrambled it up a little, and instead of it's Jerry Farmer, who's the space wolf, who's got a girl on every planet instead of Captain Kirk, and it's the doctor who is the cold, logical one instead of the executive officer and Spock. But you can clearly see, where Roddenberry appropriated many ideas from this and went forward with it. And
I mean, even the device on the belt, and he takes out, and it's got a little camera in it. It's actually very interesting watching how, really interesting ideas about how technology would be used if you could just do, anything. It's really, and actually what's very fascinating about the film for me was how strong they wanted to create this real world of a real spaceship, and there's always people running and moving in the background. It's like in Alien. I remember the director said that every button did something on the set. It wasn't just fake. So when you look at that spaceship, it feels real. And the terms, it actually reminds me a lot of submarine technology when I was looking at it. Even the way they reacted, the way they did things. And it all contributes to this sense of realness. They're not being arch, they're not being funny. They really want you to believe this is, a spaceship.
And it did seem tremendously believable. Of course, Leslie Nielsen, of course, later became known as a comic actor in the police story movies, but at this time he was one of MGM's hot leading men who they hoped to make a big star out of. Anne Francis was a new discovery, playing Altera. I have my assistant Rhea likes to describe her as born sexy yesterday, which became sort of an archetype, a trope of many movies. The completely innocent but very sexually curious and interested in young girl.
And also really intelligent. There's a kind of, I sometimes think in it that she's, she knows what she's doing. There's this idea that she's innocent, but actually the idea that she can experiment on men is actually, she doesn't see any problem with that,
The real star of the movie, of course, was Robbie the Robot.
Yes.
And unless you were there in 1956 with my 8-year-old self, you may not realize how revolutionary Robbie was. There had been robots before. Obviously, the term robot was invented by Carl Capek in RUR. There was a robot on Captain Video, Tobor, was one of Captain Video's, arch enemies. That Tobor is robot spelled backwards. And he was a cardboard box with a guy inside it, with a square head and, arms that jolted around. Gort, in The Day the Earth Stood Still, was a large silver guy who could destroy worlds, but all he mostly did was walk down a plank and all that. And they were all, with two characteristics of the robot. First of all, they all eventually rebelled against their masters,
Yeah.
well, except for Gord. That was the function of robots from RUR, you know, it's like the Frankenstein myth, you know, sooner or later the creation rebels against the maker. And that's what you expected if you were a science fiction fan. The minute Robbie came in, I would, you know, me and every other fan of that was expecting, well, this is the villain, and sooner or later he's going to rebel against his maker or something like that. And the other thing was how convincing he was, because he looked like a real robot. You could see his head, and you could see things whirring around, and lights blinking, and his ears were turning, and it wasn't just a cardboard box with a guy inside. Now, of course, there was a guy inside, but he was a short guy, and he was looking out through the places that blinked, you know, whenever he talked. Robbie became a star from this. He was so popular they made a second movie called The Invisible Boy, where he had a starring role, and then he appeared in Lost in Space, he appeared in Twilight Zone, the Flying Saucer, MGM's Flying Saucer there, the C-57D also appeared in several episodes of Twilight Zone and other things. So they spent a lot of money on this. They spent 7% of the budget, which was like $1.5 million on Robbie. And that was a lot of money to spend on a robot.
But what an investment they got back on him.
Well, they did, yes, and I'm sure they charged the other shows a fair amount of money to borrow him in later years. Forbidden Planet was a success at the box office, but it was a moderate success. It made, you know, in those days, of course, the dollar was worth more, things were legend. Forbidden Planet made a couple $100,000 profit above its cost, but it was not the huge hit that MGM hoped it to be. So they backed off somewhat on the idea of making science fiction films, making big budget, heavy special effects science fiction films. But it had an enormous influence on things that followed.
I was very struck as well by the music and the use of sound in it. It's extraordinary, even today, listening to it.
The electric tonalities by Louis and B.B. Barron were revolutionary. I mean, nobody had ever seen anything like that before. And it's still very distinctive. I mean, you could be in another room and Forbidden Planet comes on the TV and you hear that sound and you know what it is. Unfortunately, they were not members of the musicians union and they were not allowed to be nominated for an Oscar for this because it was that, well, that's not music.
Yeah.
And you're not in the union. So they couldn't even say score by or anything. It was electric tonalities by...
That's a great name for a band. I'm sure somebody must be called Electric Tonalities.
Now, again, you have to remember it was the 50s. I mentioned there are things about the film that definitely show its age. The sexual attitudes, of course, are one of them. There's very strong gender roles. The crew is all male. But it's a military crew, and in the United States at least, again, I don't know how it was in Ireland, but the United States in the 50s, the Army, the Navies, the Air Force, the Marine Corps were all male. There were women's auxiliaries, the WACs for the Army and the Waves, but they didn't serve in frontline ships. It would be 20 years before they would start putting women on aircraft carriers or battleships or destroyers. So having an all-male crew was part of the time. And it also, of course, it's an all-white crew. Truman had desegregated the Army, but only a few years before. And you didn't often see black people in films. And if you did, it was usually, I'm actually glad that they just did an all-male, all-white crew rather than throwing in an Asian houseboy or a black serving man, which they did in some other films of the same period. If this was remade today, and there's often been talk of doing a remake of Forbidden Planet, I'm sure they would have a diverse crew. The other thing is, of course, the attitude of towards sex and violence. The Hays Code still prevailed at the time. We didn't have motion picture ratings. There's a huge sexual subtext here going on. It's edible. Morbius is all alone on this planet and with a young, nubile daughter who's coming into her own sexuality, but it's played very much as subtext.
Yeah.
Well, there's one scene where you see the officers going away, and Morbius, puts his arm around his daughter, and that threaten to take his daughter away from him. Of course, is what ultimately wakes the it monster. And women in the 50s, in America at least, were still expected to be virgins until they were married, and it was before the pill. So the attitudes are being reflected here. It was actually a little racy when she starts talking about, I was just hugging and kissing, healthy stimulation. I've taken courses in biology, all of that stuff. And the violence, it is repeatedly stated that the planetary force, the id monster, rips people apart. The chief's body is spread all over the communications room. The crew at Bellerophon is ripped to shreds. But you can't show any of that in a film of the 50s. The violence is very downplayed. In movies of that era, when somebody was shot with a gun, they just sort of fell down. Sometimes they clutched, I'm shot, and they fell down.
Actually, when I was watching it, I was really struck at how much they were borrowing from the tropes of radio, which was still huge in the US at the time. And science fiction and horror radio is what really kicked off this kind of drama. Like, Buck Rogers, all of them would have, started it in this media and then went into television, film and television. And, that exact moment, I was listening to that, where he's spread all over the walls and you don't see it, but you kind of already, it's in your mind. And even the scenes with the footprints and the sound, and that would exactly be used in radio. And that was a kind of a common thing for people of that generation. So it wouldn't be too much of a stretch for them.
Whenever they talk about making a remake, I think about this issue in particular. You compare this to a movie like Alien, with the chest burster scene and things like that. And how would you do Forbidden Planet? Would you show Jerry Farmer being disemboweled and his intestines falling out and his head being sprayed across the room?
All possible.
What would happen to Morbius when it comes through and Morbius comes? You just see him sort of making a face and then he's dead. And I have actually mixed feelings about that. I mean, on one side, if any of you have read Game of Thrones or watched it, I don't shy away from violence, but I'm not sure this particular movie would be improved by being gory in that way, or being more sexually explicit.
And I think as well, because it's about unconscious, subconscious desires, and even going down. I mean, actually, just loving those scenes in the labyrinthine scenes, the little bit we see of the
Krell machine.
Yeah, the whole planet is this machine. I mean,
and you've seen that too. I mean, when you watch Star Wars and they're inside the Death Star and they're looking down,
and you see up and down, and they come across the walkway. I've seen that scene.
Yes.
Since that scene. Yes.
And those were astonishing special effects for the time. The Krell machine. Babylon 5 also used that. They was on a planet where there was a big machine. So it's a trope that's been borrowed several times. One cool thing that again was a added effect of the period was the design of the ship being a flying saucer. In 1947, an aviator named Arnold, flying somewhere in America, saw what we later called UFOs, but he described as flying saucers. He saw 9 flying saucers. That was the first reported flying saucer sighting in 1947, and in the subsequent years, hundreds of other people saw flying saucers.
Yeah.
They were called flying saucers then. The Air Force hadn't come up with the unidentified flying object, and the UFO terminology hadn't come. A very popular journalist named Donald Kehoe wrote a book called The Flying Saucers Are Real, which was a huge bestseller and convinced people that there were aliens coming, and they were coming in flying saucers. And science fiction films started picking that up. Instead of the V-2s and the rocket ships of an earlier era, you saw in The Thing from Another World, there's a crashed spaceship in the Antarctic, and they can see it in the ice. So the men go, well, stand where you can see it, let's see the shape of it. And then you see the men are all standing in a circle. It's a crashed flying saucer. And of course, Michael Rennie and Gord arrive on Earth in the day they stood in a flying saucer. But this was the best flying saucer. I love the way it comes down and then the three stairs come out. And of course, Twilight Zone made use of that in several crucial episodes in later years. That was very cool. I am a little, I love little details. I'm a fanatic for little details. I love the fact that the expedition was the Bellerophon. Those of you who know your myth know that Bellerophon was the original rider of the winged horse Pegasus in Greek myth. And he was struck down by the gods because he tried to fly Pegasus to Mount Olympus to join the gods. And Zeus didn't like that, so he hit him with a thunderbolt. After which, I think it's Theseus who picks up Pegasus later on. But Bellerophon was his first rider. I've always been a little disappointed, though, that the military ship doesn't have a cool name. C-57D
I know.
is kind of
It's pretty hard to remember.
boring. I mean, the Star Trek ship has numbers, too, which every Trekkie knows, but it's also the Enterprise. And the Millennium Falcon is the Millennium Falcon. The C-57D just doesn't hold up with those things.
And the special effects as well they still look so good, the person who did that came from Disney, and he hand drew them.
The Id Monster, yes.
Yeah, and they still, and I always think it's an interesting thing when you watch older movies where they had to be innovative and often still used, even in the likes of John Carpenter's thing, they used real,
right.
Sort of prosthetics, and it's still, even though the movies look dated, it actually, there's a certain charge to them, and I feel with the hand drawn, there's something really lively about it still.
Now, the ending, I have a very mixed reaction to the ending. It's something I love and something I hate. I love the last scene where they're all, first of all, I love the fact that Robbie is not burned out permanently.
Yes.
You're afraid you've lost Robbie, and then you see him, they're bringing him back, he's the astrogator, that's very cool. And then they watch on the view screen, they watch Altair 4 blow up, and I love the commander's speech there, that in a million years, when the human race climbs to where the Krell was in their moment of triumph and tragedy, your father's name will shine again, will be heard throughout the galaxy. But it will remind us that we are, after all, not God. Beautiful scene. I would hate to lose that scene. On the other hand, I hate the way we get to that scene, which is plunging the "let's blow up the planet" switch that happens to be in the Krell lab, which Morbius has stated earlier when he first takes them in there. This is only one of many labs. So it's like, do they all have a "let's blow up the planet" switch? And why would the Krell build, in case we need to blow up the planet, certainly, on which we all live, our civilization is, we'll put this switch here.
And that he figured that part out. Of all the millions of other things he didn't figure out, he figured out how to blow the place up. You'd think that it would be locked in the one box you can't open. But no.
Now, many movies, and when they come out, have a book that's issued to tie in with them, a novelization. I'm sure some of you have read novelizations over the years. It's a different process than, hopefully all of you have read Game of Thrones. It's good. And in Game of Thrones, the book came first, and the TV show was made later. But with a novelization, they make the movie first, and then they hire some guy to write a novelization. There was a novelization of Forbidden Planet, which is interesting in several respects. First of all, the byline on it was W.J. Stewart, and nobody knew who that was. For a long time, it was thought it was the great science fiction writer Jack Williamson, a grandmaster of science fiction who goes all the way back to the days, because Jack Williamson wrote under the name Will Stewart, was one of his pseudonyms. So was W.J. Stewart the same as Will Stewart? The Stewart was spelled differently, though. It turned out later that no, it was a mystery writer named Philip MacDonald. They found out did the novelization, and nobody really knows much about Philip MacDonald. But there's some interesting stuff in the novelization that indicates that at some point they may have thought to go in a different direction. In the novelization, there's a scene where, well, they're driving around in their little cart and they run over one of the monkeys. And Dr. Ostra takes this monkey back to the lab to dissect it. And when he dissects it, it's basically like solid meat with no functional internal organs. It has a vague thing that might be a heart and something that might be a stomach, but there's no circulatory system, there's nothing there. It has the external appearance of the monkey, but it could not possibly have lived. Which suggests that the stuff in the movie about, yes, the krill visited Earth millions of years ago, and they brought back the seeds, and that's where Altera's animals come from. That never really works if you think about it, because if they visited Earth millions of years ago, they'd be coming back with woolly mammoths or maybe dinosaurs. They wouldn't be coming back with a modern tiger and a modern monkey and a bunch of deer that you might see anywhere here in Ireland, right?
Yeah.
But if all of these creatures are creations of Morbius's mind, that's really a lovely bit of foreshadowing for the eventual revelation of the id monster.
And I think in many ways they're acting as a way to show how pure and innocent she is. And there is an indication when the tiger attacks that she's been kissed.
She's been kissed, she's felt lust, and the virginal, born sexy yesterday is about to be de-virginized. And the tiger senses that, and it's, only virgins can touch a unicorn. There's all this thing in myth. But the other interesting thing that they set up that it brings in mind is with the monkey dissection scene is there's no record that Morbius was ever married. They point that out, Your wife? There's no wife in Morbius. Oh yes, I'll look her up, Susie Smith, oh here she is. Susie. I can show you the wedding certificate. Well, what the fuck does that mean?
You can forge them, yeah.
And then here's this beautiful nubile daughter. So it actually sets up the possibility of a very different ending where Altera, too, is a fictional construct of Morbius's mind. He's all alone on his planet, and he would like to have a wife or a daughter or maybe somebody who fulfills both roles. And suddenly there's this beautiful girl. Of course, with that ending, then Altera disappears at the end, which would be kind of a shocking ending, but they planted the seeds for that.
Yeah, and in fact, if you think about it, when he's looking into the device, the image he conjures up is actually Altera.
Right.
And he says, once I take this off, she disappears.
Yeah, she's alive. He said, well, it's alive. Well, she's alive in my mind. And it's the same thing when the id monster attacks. How could it not be? It would sink by its own weight to the center of the planet. And no, it's being recreated microsecond by microsecond. The great machine is doing that. There's a level of scientific intelligence in Forbidden Planet that did not exist in many of the other science fiction films of the era. Most of the others were, atomic radiation has created giant ants.
That's right.
Or giant locusts, or Godzilla. We were very afraid of atomic radiation. But you get the impression that Cyril Hume, who wrote this, actually knew something about science and had a certain respect for it. I mean, in some ways it's more sophisticated than anything in Star Trek or Star Wars. I mean, just right at the very beginning where the narrator says, and they're going to the great main sequence star Altair. That actually has a specific meaning in astronomy, and it's cool that they know that. And this scene where Doc Ostra was presenting this cast, and he's saying, this thing makes no fucking sense. It could not be alive. It has this thing, and it has this thing, and they don't go together, and it's a biped, and it could be a quadruped. All of it is a lot of intelligence, and it has the intelligence also about Greek myth with the Bellerophon and the whole virgin threatened thing. And of course, it's Shakespearean. I mean, for those of you who some of you probably picked this up already, or others have read it, it's The Tempest. It's The Tempest on Altair 4. It's, Prospero on the island, and he's got a daughter who's never met men before until they arrive. And Robbie is Ariel, and the monster from the inn is Caliban. So it's very Shakespearean in its influences.
Yeah, there was a funny, strange theory that started to appear in my mind as I was watching it. I was thinking, well, obviously it's setting up that Dr. Morbius is the one who's creating the it monster, but I also thought it could be Altera.
Oh, that's interesting.
Because if you look at it, it's her way to escape the planet.
Mm-hmm.
And he thinks it's his. There's no actual evidence that it is his subconscious that's causing it. And they say that the crew died after she was born. So I was like, maybe she's the problem. And there's at the very end when you see her hug the new boyfriend, there was just this little smile, and I thought, oh wow, she's just got off the planet with her superpowers. Watch out, Earth, here she comes. So yeah, and she's got a very kind of, I was really struck, she's not a lot, she's such a great actress. And she played in that series Honey West.
She did, yes.
Which is the first time there was a female detective named detective TV series in America. It was about 10 years later. And I've actually watched some of Honey West. It's really charming, and she's such a great actress.
She is indeed. And Walter Pidgeon, who played Morpheus, of course, was a
brilliant,
well-established, brilliant character actor. He had done a lot of Shakespeare and other stuff like this. And I love his portrayal of Morbius. I mean, you watch this, again, just as you expect a robot to be a guy in a box and to revolt. Morbius comes on the scene and you say, okay, here's the villain. I mean, he dresses in black all the time. And he has a beard. Nobody except the bad guys had a beard in American films in the 50s.
Yeah.
A guy dressed in black with a beard, and he's a scientist.
Could obviously. Be a Soviet.
But they keep diffusing that expectation. He gives them a nice lunch.
In a gorgeous house with beautiful decor.
And then, his explanation when he shows them the secrets of the Krell. That's amazing. I also love the subtlety of that they never show us the Krell.
Yeah.
There's that great speech about they left no record of their physical thing, but look at the arch, and what does that actually mean? I mean, I imagine went to town on that. Are the Krell triangular? Are they? Obviously, they have to be like wide at the base and narrower at the top. I don't know what the Krell look like.
And I think that is funny you say that, because I had a similar thing when I was looking at the arch, and it also struck me how much, because so much is occluded, so much is not shown, that your imagination goes into the movie and it spins out all these other. So I can imagine after watching that movie, you'd sit at home and start pondering all these questions. So the movie remains with you as a result.
It does, and there's a psychological depth to this movie if you stop to think about it. I mean, the whole message. After a million years of shining sanity, the Krell could never imagine what was happening to them. Morbius is a gray character, and the guys in the spaceship are not perfect. I mean, Jerry Farmer is clearly just looking to get laid, and and he's jealous of the captain is jealous of him. There's all of this kind of subtext. You never saw that in Star Trek. You never said Bones being pissed off that Kirk always got the girl. I
think it was mandated.
It was. Everybody got along perfectly, You never saw in Star Wars, Luke Skywalker. Well, I think clearly in the first movie, it was supposed to be Luke and Leia. It's only in the second movie they decided they were brother and sister, because Harrison Ford had a lot more charisma and a lot more chemistry on screen than Mark Hamill did. So they changed that one in midstream, but still.
It's It's quite interesting, all that came out of this. One of the things, again, just from watching it, I kept thinking of you. It reminded me so much of Nigel Neal, who's a really good UK screenwriter. He did Quatermass and the Pit very famously, but he really loved Boffin's, the scientist, the person who solves the problem, and he really believed in this. But he also understood that people had a lot of unconscious, subconscious problems, which were often projected as magical, but he always believed there was a scientific, you could always find the scientific reason for it. But he valorized scientists. These were the people who would break down religion, and we would come to a place where, everything was explicable. And yet somehow there was always he always recognized there was this darkness, this difficulty in human beings to have that perfect society, that within us there is a seed that's going to mess things up.
That was another thing that I hated about the ending. For me, it's the one. I mean, there are quibbles and all that you can go, especially with changing cultural mores about questions of gender equality and diversity and all that. But for me, the real flaw is the blowing up the planet, because so many of the science fiction films, even all those giant bug movies and Godzilla and all that, the message is almost anti-scientific. It's atomic energy is bad. Research into this is bad. There are some things man was not meant to know. And real science fiction never says, and that message, you can't fucking get rid of it. I mean, you watch Jurassic Park movies and it's like, oh no, we shouldn't bring back dinosaurs. That they were extinct. We shouldn't mess with that. I want to bring back dinosaurs and go visit Dublin Island. That would be cool. I contribute to a research group that's trying to bring back the woolly mammoth. So that's cool. I don't believe there are some things man was not meant to know. And it pisses me off that they're blowing up, he says, there it goes, your father, my shipmates, all the stored knowledge of the Krell. No, don't blow up all the stored knowledge of the Krell. You have incredible resources there. Keep it. That doesn't mean you have to make monsters.
Yeah. But I mean, it's this attitude that no, we must go. We can't trust ourselves. And I think that is a dangerous quality. Surely, at some point, we have to do that.
Well, science and technology. They certainly have problems. I mean, we got global warming going on here. We got the danger of nuclear war and nuclear proliferation. We have, every technology has its dangers. If any of you haven't seen the HBO miniseries Chernobyl, go
yes.
watch it. It's fucking amazing.
Yeah.
And terrifying.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do these things. We just have to be aware of them. Otherwise, we'd still be living in the Bronze Age, or maybe even the Stone Age, if, this making bronze, some things man was not meant to do. Let's stop with this bronze making. Stone was good enough for my grandfather.
Yes. Why, try heal ourselves.
By the way, I brought Commander Adams and Altera with me. Stand up here.
Yes.
There they are, hey!
Have a look at some of these, if there's...
We have questions from the audience. Great.
Let's have some, what do you think?
Okay, 50s sci-fi films tend to be neglected by general audiences in favor of later films. Is there anything else from this period that you think is ripe for rediscovery? Some of the films that I mentioned before are certainly worth watching. The great science fiction films of the early 50s. The Day the Earth Stood Still. Watch the original version. Don't watch the horrible remake. Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Watch the 50s version is terrific. The 70s version is pretty good. The 90s version is bad. The aught version is total crap.
Oh, it's very bad.
It just gets worse and worse every time they remake
absolutely.
them. I don't know. Maybe it's my age. It's accused of that. These are films I saw when I was young, but I try to be objective, and sometimes remakes are an improvement. I mean, the Maltese Falcon we all love is the third Maltese Falcon. the one with Humphrey Bogart, but mostly they're not. Steven Spielberg's War of the Worlds has some great stuff in it.
It does.
But I still prefer George Powell's War of the Worlds. Even though they didn't disprove, I want the invaders to be Martians. I don't want to be people who've been buried for a long time, revived by lightning bolts. That makes no goddamn sense to me. And I can't get past that. But the Spielberg War of the Worlds is pretty good. And The Thing from Another World isn't interesting. Have you seen that?
Yep.
And you've seen the original version, the Howard Hawks version, or Christian Nyby, Howard Hawks, and the John Carpenter version.
Yeah, I've seen both. Yeah.
Which do you prefer?
I actually am very fond of both. Now speaking of age, I think for me, when I saw John Carpenter's The Thing, I was at a particular age and it scared the bejesus out of me. So, and I'm a horror fan, so that was quite difficult. But and I particularly loved the final scene in that movie. I think it's
it's chilling.
Yeah.
But I've always found, I've had often debates with younger people about that. I think that's a generational thing.
Yeah.
Baby boomers like me tend to prefer the Howard Hawks version, Christian Nyby version. With its great, it has some wonderful iconic lines that have echoed down, keep watching the skies, and Howard Hawks always had this intercutting dialogue that, half heard going back and forth.
Everyone should watch almost everything that Howard Hawks made.
Younger people tend to prefer the John Carpenter version. So that's another good one. George Powell's War of the Worlds, George Powell's Time Machine, again, is much better than the more recent Time Machine. It's not perfect. There are things I would change about that.
Yeah, I think as well, once you have lots of effects and more of a budget, there's a tendency to lean upon those parts rather than the story, the characters, the dialogue. As a result, things tend to go for. I mean, obviously it's a visual medium, but they forget that people can project their imagination into it.
They've been trying to remake Forbidden Planet for 20 years, and they've taken several stabs at it, and it never gets very far. And as much as I love this film, I pray that they never remake it, because I am convinced that they will screw it up beyond compare. They will bring all the violence on screen. We'll actually see people being torn to pieces. Robbie will either be, he'll look like Johnny Five or, a Cylon or something like that. Or alternatively, it'll actually be an actor who will be played by a normal actor, and then his or her skin will get ripped off and you'll see metal underneath, which they love to do.
And in fact, the Lost in Space TV series, the robot, it's not terribly good for, I didn't find it personally very engaging,
The Lost in Space robot, are you talking the original Lost in Space?
Yes, no, I'm talking about the new one that they remade on Netflix, isn't it? And I was like, oh.
The original Lost in Space, many people think Robbie was in it. And he was in it, but he was only in 2 episodes and he was a villain. But the Lost in Space robot was made by the same guy who made Robbie. He was a later and, to my mind, inferior robot. And the two of them face off in a couple of episodes of the original Lost in Space.
Who doesn't like a robot fight? Sometimes I go to movies just for that. There's actually an interesting question here you might be. See if there's...
Are there Forbidden Planet Easter eggs in my works?
Now, it says where, but you could always say there is and not say, and have people go crazy trying to find it.
That would be
It's cruel.
cheating. That would be cheating. I'm trying to think. I mean, I don't necessarily consider them Easter eggs, but I consider them little tips of the hat or homages, and I have stuck a number of those in Game of Thrones and its sequels. You can find references to a number of other great fantasy writers, Mervyn Peake and Robert Jordan and Jack Vance, the great Jack Vance. They're
Jack Vance.
Echoed in some of the names of the minor houses and sometimes even particular names of characters. You can even find the Three Stooges in there. if you look closely.
Oh my goodness.
But I don't think I ever worked in Forbidden Planet.
I can actually see people running to Wikipedia right now.
If you wrote Forbidden Planet, would Robbie the Robot have died at the end? No. Who would want Robbie to die?
I have to say, everyone else but Robbie. And
I might have been tempted to have Altera disappear, Planet blows up and, he's holding her and suddenly she's gone. No, Morbius thought her up too.
These are some really in-depth questions, people. Okay.
What are the timeless elements of this work? Example, Alfred Bester's Stars My Destination could be read today without feeling dated. Well, I think we've been talking about that. There's certainly elements of this that do feel dated. You can't. It's one of the problems of science fiction. You may say you're writing about the year 2392, but if you're writing it in 1967, it's going to reflect the attitudes of 1967, not 2392. And so in that way, it shows being dated more than, a movie made in 1956 that's about 1956. It doesn't tend to leap out at us. So, the things here that are dated are clearly the all-male crew, the all-white crew, and certain elements of the sexual attitudes and all of that. But there are things that are timeless, I think. The whole question of the monster from the id that lives inside all of us. And if it had access to a Krell machine, who knows what the world would be like.
And just make sure the person who has access to the Krell machine is a good person, well-disciplined.
Yeah, well, that's hard.
Yeah.
Currently, we have a president of the United States who I think is the monster from the id.
Do not let him near the Krell machine, please.
No, that would be really bad. That would be really bad.
This is quite a...
What's your process for creating compelling characters? Is there an example that reflects it in the movie? Well, I think, for me, the most compelling character, if we disallow Robbie, is Morbius. Morbius is, despite wearing all black and having a beard, is not a cartoon villain. He is a noble man who's concerned about the ethics. I mean, he admires the Krell, not just that they made starships and towers of porcelain and glass and adamantine steel, but also because they were ethical and they'd left all this behind. And he's concerned about the uses to which knowledge may take place. He's, in many ways, a good man, but inside him are these lusts and these angers, and it all comes out. And to my mind, that is the key to creating a compelling character and a human character. I don't like characters who are all white or all black, because I don't see them in real life. You read biographies, you read histories, and some of the noblest men in history had flaws, and some of the most vile people in history had, good attributes. Hitler liked dogs. He was very nice to dogs. How do you weigh that against someone who maybe hated dogs and killed them, but was a wonderful, benevolent person in other respects? We always have to wrestle with that, and we see this in America. There are campaigns to take Woodrow Wilson's name off things. I think he was one of the great American presidents, but he was also a racist. But he tried to end war, and he founded the League of Nations, and all of that. People are complex, and the best characters reflect that complexity and the struggle that we all have to do good, and how do we define good?
Yeah, I mean, all of us have friends or relatives, and they've got this, you love them dearly, and they have these great characters, and then out of the blue they say something terrible, and you think, oh my goodness. But you can't, you have to accept people for, nobody is perfect, and the idea that you just start discarding people because they're not perfect,
right,
I think is a difficulty, and I think it's somewhat you can see a little bit on social media of polarization of you're only all good or if you're not all good, or certainly online, then you can be discarded. And I'm not sure that's a great way to go into a kind of a complex discussion, which is why complex discussions can't be conducted online. But, yeah.
Let's see, my favorite book is 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne, and The Nautilus Amazes Me. What is your favorite machine you've seen from sci-fi? Well, I do love The Time Machine from H.G. Wells. In the book, of course, it's cool, but as visualized, the George Powell version of The Time Machine is amazing. It's just amazing. And you could buy a life-size replica of that if you have $100,000 that you don't know what to do with. There's the same guy who makes the Robbie replicas out in California has made one, and I don't know what I would do with a time machine in my living room, but it's pretty impressive with all the velvet and the Victorian and the big wheel that spins behind and all the little levers with crystal knobs and all that. It's just a great looking machine. And I also love the Martian tripods in War of Worlds. When George Powell made his version of War of Worlds, he couldn't do the tripods. Getting the legs to work was, they tried, but the special effects of today were not equal. It looked too phony. So instead he gave us these kind of manta rays that float on levitation beams or something like that. But they're really cool looking and creepy. So I've always loved the manta rays of War of the Worlds, early version.
Sort of touching upon some of the things you've asked about making a remake and how you would change.
If you were put in charge of a Forbidden Planet remake, how would you change the gender dynamics of the original to make it work for the 21st century? Well, you'd certainly have a crew, I think, that would be, there's 18 prime physical specimens who've been locked up in hyperspace for 1.5 years, as he says. And you still could have 18 prime physical specimens, but some of them, should be African and some of them should be Asian, and, they should be a mixed crew. And you have to be, if you make the crew half women, though, what does that do to the love story and the whole idea that nobody has seen a woman for 1.5 years, which clearly drives at least Jerry Farmer. You'd have to adjust to, because obviously you need the captain falling in love with Altera and vice versa. So the captain has to fall in love with her despite the presence of presumably 9 women on his ship among his 18 prime physical specimens. So why would that? Well, maybe it's just true love or a romantic thing. We fall in love with who we fall in love with, right?
Yeah, well, it's kind of interesting. He's on a ship full of men. I mean, they could like each other. Maybe he's the only straight person on the ship. But yeah, there's lots you can do with gender dynamics, including one of the things I find interesting. If you're going to go that far in the future, why don't you have people who are, somewhat machine, somewhat human? Does it have to be a romantic story? Do you have to be always driven by a romantic story? It's obviously, I think, Forbidden Planet is very much of its time, and I'm always a little less. Maybe I'm just some sort of hard-hearted person, but sometimes I'm not interested in the love story. Like, say, The Martian, one of the things I loved about that movie was, he actually doesn't have, which would be the classic Hollywood thing of he's got a wife and a child at home and they're pining after him and that's his main goal. But actually he's got, parents and he doesn't have kids and he's there for science. I love that drive. It doesn't always have to be about having a relationship for me.
I mean, there's certainly ways to do it, but you would have to think through every ramification because you can't, in a story, you can't just change one element.
Yeah.
You change one element and it affects other elements and it all adds up here. So You know, you could make Morbius a woman and Altera a boy and the Captain a woman, and how does all that add together?
Yeah.
You could make Altera not the daughter, but the wife who died supposedly. Maybe she's tired of being all alone on this planet with Morbius.
Yeah, you could go to a Solaris scenario, as you. But the thing is that when you have to remake a film, you have to look at the fundamentals. What are you trying to say, and what are you trying to say today versus back then? And then stuff comes from that.
But I think that the drive to remake these classic films is a drive to cash in on their reputation and to make money on it. And the screenwriters always feel the need, and I guess the studio heads do too, because they give them notes to change stuff. We don't do that with Shakespeare. When somebody puts on a new version of Richard III, I mean, maybe they'll change the setting, but they don't rewrite all the dialogue and all that stuff.
Yeah, and
why can't we remake these classic films using the original scripts and just remake them with different actors and better special effects? Let's see Morbius. Walter Pidgeon is long gone, but there are great character actors who could play Morbius. That would be great. Would we like Morgan Freeman as Morbius on the planet, or you name your favorite great character actor. There's lots of people to do it, but don't mess with the dialogue.
I think we're going to have to start wrapping things up. Is that what I'm getting? Sorry, I'm getting the 5-minute wave. So at this point, before we leave, if you could all just remain seated, and George will and his friends will head out the door first, if you don't mind. Thank you so much for coming.
Yes, I hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you, George.